Good morning. Welcome to Sunday worship live for the Diocese of Hereford. This week it's from St Mary's Alverley and St Andrew's Quat on the Shropshire-Worcestershire border. My name's Vicky and I'm a member of these parishes. Coming up, we have contributions from Kirsty and Benoit, who also belong to the parishes, and the reading from my son Joseph, and our Vicar Neil will be bringing us the sermon based on the reading. I hope you enjoy it.
Good morning. I think for all of us, lockdown has brought many difficulties and challenges and has perhaps strained relationships and shown up fault lines in relationships, both inside and outside our households. Or perhaps the greater time for reflection has made us more aware of pre-existing problems and fractured relationships. There is everywhere a great need for forgiveness, and that's a subject I wanted to say a little bit about, but not in a glib way, but acknowledging how difficult this can be. We all strive and perhaps often succeed to forgive the lesser hurts, but struggle massively where we've suffered great pain, hurt, injustice, or even betrayal. We know perhaps from our own experience situations where the issue involved is so painful that we can't forget, can't forgive, and can't get over it. It becomes a deep wound, an obsession. Even if we've buried the hurt, it can resurface from nowhere. We can't forgive until the other person has recognised our pain, the wrong they've done us, or until we can get some form of justice, perhaps even some form of punishment for the other person. Sometimes this is impossible. They won't apologise or recognise what they've done. Maybe we don't see them anymore, or perhaps they're no longer alive. At this point, I believe the only possible way to resolution for us is forgiveness. The only way we can be delivered from our own pain and set free from a need for retribution, justice, or punishment, so that that need doesn't overshadow our lives and obsess us, so that we don't get a knee-jerk reaction of pain, anger, or suffering every time we're reminded of that person or that incident. Matthew chapter 6, verses 14 to 15 remind us that for a Christian, forgiveness is not optional, it's mandatory. We are called to forgive as we have been and are forgiven. If you forgive those who sin against you, your heavenly Father will forgive you. But if you refuse to forgive others, your Father will not forgive your sins. But it's just those things which are most painful to us, where we most need to be set free from our suffering, which we're often incapable of forgiving by ourselves. I recently read something of the story of the Dutch woman Corrie ten Boom, who along with other members of her family hid Jews in their home from the Nazi persecution during the Second World War. The family were ultimately betrayed, and Corrie and her sister Betsy were sent to the Ravensbrück concentration camp, where Betsy died. Corrie survived the camp and dedicated her life afterwards to speaking and writing about the love of God and how he can forgive even our worst sins. At the end of one such public meeting in Germany, where Corrie spoke of Ravensbrück and of God's forgiveness, she was approached by a man she recognised as one of the former guards at the camp. He told her he had found Christ as his saviour and knew that he had been forgiven for all the terrible things that he had done, but wanted to hear that she forgave him too. Faced with this impossible situation, as the memories flooded back of all that she and Betsy had suffered at this man's hands, Corrie was thrown back on her own, saying, "Forgiveness is not an emotion, it is an act of the will." As she prayed, saying that she could just manage to stretch out her hand to the man, but God must supply the feeling of forgiveness, she found that suddenly her heart was filled with love for this man, and she was able to say, "With all my heart, I forgive you too." It's Alexander Pope who has said, "To err is human, to forgive divine." In these impossible situations where we cannot get over the insurmountable hurdle by ourselves, we can ask God to help us. This reminds us of the example set by Jesus at his crucifixion, where he prayed, "Father, forgive them, for they know not what they do." Our prayer may need to be, "Father, forgive them, although they know what they do, what they did." But as we see from Corrie ten Boom, the very act of asking for God's forgiveness for those who've wounded us so deeply can shift something in us and move us towards wholeness, healing, and real forgiveness. We may not forget the harm that was done to us, but it can stop hurting us and controlling our thoughts, our feelings, and our lives. As we all know, to be on the receiving end of forgiveness, especially where we expected and perhaps deserved to pay a price for what we've done, is hugely liberating. We feel great relief and gratitude. We enjoy restored relationship. We have the example of God's vast and extraordinary love in forgiving our wrongdoing. I believe that if we could really understand and feel the unexpected, undeserved, and breathtaking generosity of God's forgiveness, it would transform our lives. I'd like to end with a poem by Andy Rain of the Northumbria community. It's about the regenerative effect of being forgiven, but to my mind applies equally to when we are able to act with God in forgiving what to us is unforgivable. There is new life, new hope, new freedom, and new possibilities. I am not here to pass judgment or point the finger at anyone. My name was written in the sand as one who is forgiven. Strengthened with hope, impervious to shame, I will walk freely like the freshness of the dry lands after rain. Let light spill out of heaven through my life, dispelling mediocrity and silent blame. Too many people, guilt-stricken, wounded, walk in regret, feeling bad about failing, apologize even for breathing. Raw belief, a passion for others, grows in me, encircling each moment with instinctive prayer. I will carry the freshness of the dry lands after rain. Compassion lives in me again.
Good morning, it's Benoit. I've already been introduced by Kirsty. I'm going to tell you how lockdown has been for me. Quite different to a whole lot of you. Some of it has been sad, but there's been a lot of nice things that happened during this lockdown. I'm just outside Compton, where I normally work on a Monday, but because of the COVID crisis, I've been redeployed to work mainly in New Cross Hospital. Compton has another branch which houses the education centre and also the lymphedema care. This is the team of nurses and doctors that has been working with me, and I'm here in my special equipment to go into a COVID ward. To thank my team members, Jean, Hazel, Hannah, Becky, Lynn, Narendra, and Fiona, and many others who supported the patients with dedication. Thank you for you who caught COVID and had to take some time off to recover. And we would like also to say thank you to the Compton team of nurses and doctors who admitted so many patients from New Cross Hospital to give them dignity and compassion in the last few days of their lives. Although everybody in the palliative care team who were affected by the virus made a recovery, the brother of one of our nurses passed away from the disease, and one of our consultant colleagues died during the pandemic after a 6-month battle with cancer. I pray God that they will be welcome in His kingdom.
This reading is taken from Matthew chapter 13, verses 1 to 9 and verses 18 to 23. That same day Jesus went out of the house and sat by the lake. Large crowds gathered around him, so he got into a boat and sat down, while the people stood on the shore. Then Jesus used stories to teach them many things. He said, "A farmer went out to plant his seed. While he was planting, some seed fell by the road, and the birds came and ate it all up. Some seed fell on the rocky ground, where there wasn't much earth. The seed grew very fast, because the ground was not deep. But when the sun rose, the plants dried up, because they did not have deep roots. Some other seed fell among thorny weeds, which grew and choked the good plants. Some other seed fell on the good ground, where it grew and produced a crop. Some plants made 100 times more, some made 60 times more, and some made 30 times more. You people who can hear me, listen." So listen to the meaning of the story about the farmer. What is the seed that fell by the road? That seed is like the person who hears the message about the kingdom but does not understand it. The evil one comes and takes away what was planted in the person's heart. And what is the seed that fell on the rocky ground? Well, the seed is like the person who hears the teaching and quickly accepts it with joy. But he does not let the teaching go deep into his life, so he keeps it only a short time. When trouble or persecution come because of the teaching he accepted, he quickly gives up. And what is the seed that fell among the thorny weeds? That seed is like the person who hears the teaching but lets worries about this life and the temptation of wealth stop that teaching from growing. So the teaching does not produce fruit in that person's life. But what is the seed that fell on the good ground? That seed is like the person who hears the teaching and understands it. That person who grows and produces fruit, sometimes 100 times more, sometimes 60 times more, and sometimes 30 times more. This is the word of the Lord.
Thanks for that. That was really good. When I was a young lad, growing up in rural Warwickshire, I used to every summer help with the hay baling for the farmer. Many of us would do it, and every Friday we would collect round the farmer's door after working the whole week to get our wages. Almost a biblical scene, isn't it? One of the characters that would help every year was a man in his mid-70s who'd worked on the land all of his life since he was a young boy. The guy could still throw a bale of hay right back into the corner of a barn like no one's business. Truly amazing. As I worked with him, I got to know him a little bit more, and he had a very sad story. He had been left abandoned as a baby on a doorstep, never knew his family, and the stigma of that in that age when he was born meant that he kept himself to himself. He was very much a lonely man. He faced poverty, he faced persecution, and he faced ridicule. Every Friday, as we were round the farmer's door waiting for our wages, this gentleman would put his hand in his pocket and take out just a handful of small, very old coins. And he would tell us the same thing every week, that when he first started as a lad, that is how much he earned for the week's work. Not much at all. When I thought and read this parable today, I thought of him. I thought of the land that we worked together, and I suspect he often walked the hard-packed path of prejudice, a path where not much grows, where life and opportunities are too quickly snatched away. I bet he knew what it was to live a life between a rock and a hard place. On the rocky ground, life withers because you can't put down roots. There's no security or stability, and the sun burns. He surely walked amongst the thorns of violence, fear, anger, and poverty. I've no doubt that those thorns wrapped themselves around him, choking away dignity, security, and trust. I hope the best soil he walked through was not the few pennies a day soil that he was working on all the time. I hope at times he stood in the rich soil that nourished life, love, and hope. We may not have ploughed fields or worked on the land for a few pennies a day, but we all know the different landscapes of which Jesus speaks in this parable. We know the beaten path of life. We've stumbled through the rocky patches of life. We have been scratched and cut by the thorns of life, and we've planted our roots deep in the sacred soil of life that feeds and grows for us to become a harvest. In one case 100-fold, another 60, and another 30. Jesus is not just describing different types of soil or circumstances of life. He is describing our inner geography. These are the various landscapes of the human heart. We have met these in others and discovered them in ourselves. We are rarely just one type of soil. Sometimes we could be all four. The four soils are descriptive of how we live and relate to others and to God. Jesus' interpretation of the parable, when he tells what happens to the seeds, describes the consequences of each kind of life. At one level, the parable invites us to be self-reflective and examine the kind of life we're living, and that's really good and important. That is important work, and there is nothing wrong with doing that. I think that's how we most often use, and unfortunately though, abuse this parable. We seem to stop it there. We live in a world that thrives on competition, comparison, and judgment. And so we reduce the parable to one obvious question: what kind of dirt are you? In doing so, we put ourselves at the centre of the parable and push the character of the sower to the background. The what kind of dirt are you question is not, however, the only way to read this parable. The question may be just a decoy that distracts us from the other ways of reading this parable. And that's the difficulty of parables. We tend to try and read and understand parables through the lens of our world and our world experience and worldview. The result is that we hear but do not understand, we see but do not perceive. The parable does not make sense. A farmer goes out and sows seed on public pathways, on rocky ground, and amongst the thorns. This is simply wasteful, inefficient, and ineffective. It's actually bad farming. If I spoke to any of the farmers in my parishes and said this is what I intended to do, they would tell me to continue trying to be a vicar and leave farming to them. The sower, it has to be said, is not much of a farmer. You can't plant seeds among the rocks and thorns or on a path and then act surprised or complain that nothing grew. The story Jesus tells simply does not fit in our world. To know that is the beginning of understanding this parable. The parable offers a different perspective, a new worldview. They give us a glimpse into God's world and what God is like. They heal our eyes and our ears so that we might understand and hear, see and perceive. Parables are not meant to test human intelligence, thank goodness. They are seeds of grace that test our heart's willingness to surrender and to be enveloped in the always surprising generosity of God. The surprising generosity of God is exactly what the parable of the sower reveals to us. As different as the four soils are, they all hold two things in common: seeds and the sower. The sower sows the same seeds in all four soils with equal hard work, equal hope, and equal generosity. The sower does so without evaluation of the soil's quality or potential. There is no soil left unsown. This is not about the quality of dirt. It's actually about the quality of God, the divine sower. We want to judge what kind of dirt we are, while God simply wants to sow his life into ours. Whether we are a few pennies a day soil, £1,000 a day soil, we are sown with the seeds of God. No life, no person, no soil is left unsown. Seeds here, seeds there, seeds everywhere. That seems like poor planning. Given today's economy, that's just wasteful. By today's farming practices, it is inefficient. With the cost of seeds and the time spent sowing, it may not even be profitable. These are not, however, the sower's concerns. They are our concerns. Thankfully, this parable is about God's faithfulness and not actually about farming, soil quality, or how things work in this world. In the sower's world, wastefulness gives way to hope, inefficiency to love, and profitability to generosity. Do you know what? Every part of your life has been sown with the seeds of God. And do you know what happens to seeds? Given the right conditions, apple seeds become apples, peach seeds become peaches, and God's seeds become more than we could ever possibly imagine. God has invested his love into you, no matter who you are, where you are, what you feel about yourself. Everyone can thrive. Everyone can feel that love. I hope this message has blessed you today. Keep going. There will be better days. God bless.